Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, we've got some interesting updates. It's not been really a complete ceasefire, but it's sort of been a lull as Israel, Iran, the United States, and a number of other countries sit there and wait for the next shoe to fall in regards to what's going on in West Asia. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And well, the U.S. appears to be getting partially involved, but it's not really as big a thing as the media headlines would want to tell you.
Yeah, firstly, obviously, thanks as well for joining me in the discussion today, Ken. Let's qualify something, because when you first spoke, Ken, I can guarantee someone's going to get completely misunderstand it. We're purely in this context talking about a kind of lull in what's anticipated to be an Israeli response. We're not referring to what's going on in Hezbollah and
Correct.
Lebanon and what's still to some extent going on in Gaza. They're very separate issues. So we're not saying that there's a ceasefire, because we know that's not the case. We know that Israel's targeting facilities, etc., and in Lebanon. We know that to be the case, and there's still some sort of sporadic fighting going on with Hamas in Gaza. So with respect to the issue of the Israeli retaliation, there are some interesting points, and we thought it was a good time to discuss those, and that's what Ken was referring to. So let's just clear that up before we get started. So I think I want to come back to an initial point, and I have said this before, but I want to make it again because it's very important to do so. From October the 7th, 2023, when this whole conflict started to unfold, I made the point the United States does not want to go to war with Iran. It needs this whole conflict like a hole in the head, and it absolutely doesn't want an escalation. And we've discussed those reasons before, but I'm going to reiterate them just very briefly. Firstly, it doesn't want an escalation, and it gets tangled indirectly into a war with Iran because Iran has hypersonic missiles. It can destroy all its bases in the Middle East, and it can destroy its carrier strike groups, etc., that are dotted around West Asia, whether it's the Mediterranean, somewhere in the Red Sea, there's claims there's US military personnel, and the list goes on and on. So they're just, in very broad terms, the fundamental reasons. They just don't want to get caught up in there. And I have stood by that because it was very obvious. And there are also economic, financial reasons, because if Iran closes the Straits of Hormuz, then the price of oil will go to $200 a barrel. It will probably blow up the Western financial system. But also the US is dependent on oil imports from that region, and it's about 25 to 30%. That's something else people are not aware of, that the US, again, is not independent in an oil sense. So that's just some principal background, and we've talked about it before, so I'm not going to go into masses of detail because we're not here to repeat ourselves ad nauseum every day, because otherwise that's a waste of your time, and frankly also a waste of our time. So that's the initial point worth making. Now, when you take that in, bear that in mind, then the following doesn't seem like a lie, as many people think it is, or implausible, or just some kind of unbelievable to consider this to be a possibility. But let's go back to April, when obviously the Iranians struck targets inside Israel, and then there was a very muted Israeli response, and it all kind of went quiet, and that was the end of that risk of a gigantic provocation and an escalation into a war between the two countries. And who was one of the principal nations that did everything to prevent that escalation? And that was the United States. This is irrefutable, because again, the US doesn't want escalation. So they kind of reached an agreement with the Iranians. Well, look, they'll just bomb a couple of targets, the Israelis. just, for cosmetic reasons. It looks like they're being tough. We all know they're not. They ended up bombing empty facilities, so it was meaningless. Iran had already moved their personnel out of these facilities, and bear in mind, it wasn't even in Iran; it was in Syria. So that was one instance, and the US has done everything it can to try and prevent an escalation again with respect to Israel and Iran. Now, of course, this all ties in with this much anticipated Israeli response. Now, we hear a lot of noise coming out of the media from various personalities. And again, we'll park that for a second because you've got a point you wanted to make specifically about that, Ken. But I'm just saying it's the usual kind of statements, and everyone takes them literally. Never take them literally, because the Ukraine war proved that, where there was countries in Europe screaming about wanting to send their forces in to fight the Russians. And then they admitted, inadvertently admitted, oh, that was never our intention. We didn't want to get into a direct war with Russia for very obvious reasons. Again, so where we are currently, or what we understand to be the case is, and obviously this might change in 5 minutes' time, and when the deed is done, so to speak, then the Israelis might do something entirely different. But the belief is, and this has come from multiple sources who've said, look, there's been an agreement reached, in inverted commas, and I stress in inverted commas, between the Israelis and the Americans. Look, you're not bombing nuclear facilities, meaning the Israelis. You're not bombing oil facilities. You can hit some military targets. Now, what that means in reality, we have to wait and see. But you can absolutely guarantee, and this flies in the face of just about anybody else who talks on this subject, but so be it, because we were 100% correct about the Ukraine war. And after a year of being completely vindicated and having the perspective of the US not wanting to go to war directly or indirectly with Iran, that, if that happens, then we'll come on to the question, what might the Iranian response be to that? But I'll pass it over to you, Ken.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a Washington Post report, that came out, and a lot of this is behind it, in regards to what the Biden administration is trying to get Netanyahu, Israel, to focus on with Iran rather than the nuclear facilities, the energy facilities, etc. Because I think they understand that if all of a sudden there's strikes that affect the supply of oil and the price of oil in the region, that's going to immediately expand the tactics that other nations use in regards. And a great example has been that Iran may just simply close the Strait of Hormuz, and there it goes. That's done, among other things. Interestingly, Netanyahu has come out today and denied that this was. And it goes back to what you were saying about the rhetoric. We really don't know right off the top of the head if Netanyahu is trying to act strong rather than be in deference to the Biden administration in regards to what they can or cannot do. We'll only know that when they do their retaliatory strike. And of course, the Biden administration is promising, oh, we're going to send you some THAAD missiles as protection and defense for the hypersonics that likely to come from Iran if there is another retaliatory strike and this thing really starts to escalate. But the interesting thing, and it's what you noted, my thoughts on this, the finance minister for Israel has come out and suddenly said we need to take the borders all the way to Damascus and eventually Lebanon and make this greater Israel. Well, this is something Netanyahu has been talking about going back for more than a decade. It's his master dream plan. The reality of it, of course, is that there are weaker nations But many of those weaker nations, like as with Yemen, have proven themselves to be much stronger, much more powerful than Israel gives them credit for. And I think the bottom line is it's the same thing that Zelensky. Zelensky has been begging or hoping, pining all of his hopes that NATO will start sending in troops to relieve their shortage of manpower and make this a NATO European war against Russia, not a SMO against Ukraine. I think Netanyahu is banking on the fact that he believes that the United States will step in and be willing to put their own soldiers and fight the war for Netanyahu. That's the bottom line where I think all this rhetoric is coming from, and where most of the attacks have been on the weaker fronts, because in regards to this, he has created what I might call a seven-front war, a seven-front conflict with nations that some have patience, some do not, some are just absolutely being vilified, or I should say, shown to the world that, hey, these are primarily civilians without a military presence, and it's easy pickings. So who's really the aggressor here? And I think in a lot of cases, as you pointed out, Netanyahu is trying to appear strong when he's absolutely weak. I mean, just look at the rhetoric that comes out. There was a recent drone strike on a dining facility for Israeli citizens, and the president of Israel comes out and says, oh, it's against the Quran to attack soldiers who are eating. That's the most inane, idiotic, lunatic statement that anybody can make in a time of conflict. So when you make that type of rhetoric, you really, for all intents and purposes, are absolutely weak and are desperate for somebody stronger to come in and save your bacon. And in essence, that to me is why I think Israel really is holding off on Iran. And it's something that you're going to go ahead and make some notes on in regards to, I think Israel really doesn't know what powerful nation could be backing Iran, but has not made it that well public.
Yeah, let's go through a number of points. First off, these statements by Israeli cabinet members of Netanyahu's government are meaningless. We had all the same rhetoric by Western politicians. They're just trying to sound tough. They're trying to appease growing numbers of people in Israel who have had enough of the war and want it over. So this is just to sound tough, going, look, there's never going to be a greater Israel. This is another one of these things in folklore that at one time might have been a possibility. It's just never going to happen. And it's just trying to sound like, we're still in control, even though what we've seen is they can't defeat Hamas. That's how weak they are. They can't. They tried this incursion into southern Lebanon with Hezbollah and it's failed. So they can't do that either. So there is no weak nations against the Israelis. The Israelis can't do anything about the Houthis in Yemen in any way, shape, or form. So all it's proving is, yeah, they can go and get in planes and bomb whatever, but they can't fight a ground war. They just cannot do this. So that's the first point worth making. Now, with regards to THAAD and the missile defense system, the US has promised them a THAAD missile defense system. Now, it's supposed to have arrived already in Israel. It can fire in one go 48 rockets. And the question is, how many times can they fire this? Can they replenish the stock that quickly? I mean, how long does it take to reload things, etc., etc.? How many THAAD missiles have they got access to? Because this is a fundamental problem from a logistics perspective and a manufacturing weapons. The US cannot manufacture weapons anywhere near quick enough that the Ukrainians needed, and certainly the Israelis need. So that's an enormous problem. And also, that system cannot shoot down hypersonic missiles. So when Iran, if there was another retaliatory strike from the Iranians, all that means is they will shoot none of them down. So it's just a kind of, again, a meaningless statement. There's no substance to it. The argument people are saying, well, it's better than the Patriot system. Well, not against hypersonics, so it's an irrelevance. It just, again, is just noise for political consumption and the consumption of people. So that's another extremely important point to make, because, and then we come on to, I think, what's equally as important, because there has been a lot of Western sources coming out and admitting after the recent Iranian strike, and we said at the time the depletion of the Iron Dome in terms of the interceptor missiles and what they had available, literally they're scraping the barrel, which means, and translated into simple English, the Iron Dome defense system is a sitting duck. They cannot defend themselves against another barrage of Iranian missiles, whether it's 100, 200. And the argument is, from the Iranian perspective, and okay, people can say they're calling their bluff or they're just lying. Well, do you want to take the risk? No, no one should want to take that risk. Next time it could be 500 Iranian missiles. Israel cannot defend against those. And the THAAD, it's just tokenism. And then we come on to the question of Iran and the Iranian-Russian relationship. And that is a huge bone of contention and concern for the United States and, by extension, Israel. And I think what's very telling with regards to this is this very ambiguous statement the Russians came out with, or the Kremlin came out saying, we're not going to reveal whether there are clauses on no to mutual defense in the strategic partnership agreement with Iran. Now, that's one heck of a loaded statement, because the argument could be, well, are the Russians telegraphing that indeed they do? Does that mean that if the Iranians are under attack from the Israelis in a substantial way, that the Russians are going to intervene? I mean, and it's these are the kind of, it could be just a gigantic mind game to try and focus the Americans as much as anything. And maybe this has focused minds in the US. Maybe it hasn't. What we do know is there are still back channel lines for discussion between the Russians and the Americans regarding, avoiding conflicts, flashpoint misunderstandings with respect to Ukraine. I'm pretty sure it could also apply with respect to West Asia and what's going on, particularly given the military presence that the Russians have in Syria. So that's also something that has to be figuring in the minds of both the Americans and the Israelis, because relations between the Israelis and the Russians is not in a very good state whatsoever. We've talked about that before, so again, we're not going to repeat that, but the detail of that, but that's an important issue as well. And therefore, on that basis, the question for the Israelis is, okay, we might just completely ignore what the Americans said and just do whatever we want to do. But here's the problem, and this is another huge weakness that Netanyahu has. He's 100% dependent on the Americans for everything. Now, in a separate matter, and this may be just, again, lip service and have no substance, and the argument is, why are you giving the Israelis 30 days notice? But the Americans have come out and said, if you do not resolve the humanitarian crisis in Gaza in 30 days, we're putting an arms embargo on you, Israel. Now, people will say that's nonsense, and I don't believe it. Well, maybe it's true. Just because people don't want to believe something doesn't mean it's not the case. Now, the argument is it shouldn't be 30 days. It should be 3 days. In fact, it shouldn't even be 3 days. It should be do it now, or we will implement that policy. But the point is, if the United States is that concerned about an escalation in this conflict or potential conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians, then the question is, they might just cut off all support and supplies to the Israelis. And that's the Achilles heel for Netanyahu, because he's totally dependent on them for not just financial aid, but military support, because the Israelis are out of a lot of missiles, etc., themselves, because they've now had to use the Iron Dome on 2 occasions. And the question is, and it's not well understood, to what extent of those interceptors being depleted to the extent they're almost non-existent. Well, Western sources are claiming that is the case. So, and that's quite likely, and we reached that assessment ourselves based on what had happened, during the 2 previous Iranian attacks. So it's not a simple question that Israel's acting from a point of strength. They're not. They have no allies in the Middle East except the United States, and even the US seems to be putting caveats in place. So this is not turning out, we've said that before, how Netanyahu expected it to be. And okay, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, so to speak. So we have to wait and see what the actual Israeli response is. But let's say Israel does bomb a few token sites. There's some kind of a tacit agreement again with the Iranians, and it all goes quiet, and that's the end of it. The question is, though, what happens if there isn't that agreement, and they're just banking on Iran going, well, okay, that was pretty minimal, so we'll just stop that? Or, could we risk seeing an Iranian response? And if there is an Iranian response, and the Iron Dome is depleted to that extent, and the THAAD's useless in terms of shooting hypersonics down, and the risk is it could be targeted itself, well, then the question is that what's going to then be the escalation and the damage it would do to Israel in the process. So there are all these things that now have to be factored into the equation. It's not a simple black and white binary decision-making process. It's far more complicated. And I think we've just highlighted there why you would like to think, and that's the very dangerous thought to have because of the unpredictable nature of Netanyahu, that he may heed the United States' advice, even though, of course, he claimed there's no advice. And because, again, he has to project power, he has to project the idea that he's in charge. Well, he might be notionally in Israel, but he's not in charge of the United States in some senses. I mean, okay, there is this conflict of interest with the US and internally because of how the political structure is. But overall, the question is, when's the Israeli response going to be? And then we have to hope it is muted. And then we have to hope there has been some agreement reached with the Iranians to say, okay, call it quits, although there has been statements that have just come out from the Iranians saying we basically cut off that line of communication we had with the Americans because we basically don't think at this point in the conflict it's worth having it. Maybe we'll revisit it in the future. It's difficult to know, what discussions they've had because they've been ongoing pretty frequently for the last year. That might mean something or it might mean nothing. So I think hopefully in having this discussion, we're giving people a bit of food for thought as to that things are never as simple as and black and white as people are led to believe. And this is why, again, we stand by the point, the US doesn't want to get into a direct war with Iran and won't. And it certainly equally doesn't want to get sucked into an indirect war because then it knows it's also then a target for the Iranians. And we've discussed that previously and why the US would be sitting ducks as well in that region, and its bases could not survive a full onslaught from the Iranians.
I think when all is said and done, the uh, surgical strike by Iran on Israel with minimal collateral damage, casualties, but completely on important sites and military installations was a vast wake-up call in regards to the fact that US analysts, European analysts, and especially Israel kept thinking things in the mindset of the Cold War era. Same way the US thought that Russia would fall very quickly. Oh, we just have to duplicate what we did in the 1980s, and they'll fall quickly. Well, this isn't the 1972 in Munich and a terror attack, an idiotic terror attack to make a political statement. This was a sovereign nation's show of power and then silence. This is just a taste of what we can do. We don't have to say any more. And it just, I would bet it rang bells in Washington, in Tel Aviv, all across the world, that this is not the West Asia, the Middle East of the 1970s, of the small, nations trying to figure out where they have standing in a Cold War era, which side of the two great superpowers on. No, these are nations that have established their own sovereign directions, making their own choices and realizing that they are extraordinarily powerful. Look at Yemen. The US supplied all these arms to Saudi Arabia. Yemen should have been decimated, but they recovered extraordinarily quickly, enough to wreak havoc in the water channels around Haifa and West Asia and the Red Sea. Iran, they figured, was nobody, and they made a statement. Iraq is quickly recovering and wanting to push the United States out, and they're almost at the point that they could do it at any time. So the world has changed, and many of the thinkers and think tanks are still in this old mentality. And while, I would say that there are different analysis suddenly taking place, their wargaming doesn't work anymore until they get rid of their 60, 70, 80-year-old clowns that are sitting there in charge. I think it's going to be just, a culmination of that axiom, where the learners will inherit the earth and the learned will find themselves no longer capable in a world that no longer exists.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely true, and it's a good point to end this podcast there, I think.
Very good. Paul, as always, thank you for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise, of course.
And to everybody here, thank you for being a part of the Sirius Report community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, share. Send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.